Every year, at the exact same moment. Cities erupt in light. Clocks reset. Promises are made. And the world collectively agrees that something new has begun. January 1st. It feels natural. Almost inevitable. As if the year couldn't begin anywhere else. But that feeling, that sense of inevitability, didn't come from nature. The earth doesn't recognize January. The sun doesn't pause for it. The seasons don't wait for midnight. Yet billions of people align their lives to this single date. Salaries reset. Governments open new budgets. Schools restart cycles. Corporations redraw targets. Entire economies inhale and begin again. All on the same day. That kind of coordination doesn't happen by accident. For most of human history, the year didn't begin in winter. It began with planting. With floods. With the return of light. With survival. The idea that a year should start in the coldest, darkest part of the cycle would have seemed impractical. Even irrational. And yet, that is exactly where it begins today. So the question isn't when the year starts. The real question is who decided it should start here. Because once you trace that decision backward, you don't find astronomy. You don't find nature. You don't even find tradition. You find administration. You find authority. You find power. Empires needed order. Leaders needed synchronization. And time. Time turned out to be the most efficient tool. Control the calendar. And you don't have to control people directly. You just have to control when things begin. And when they end. In this video, we're not counting down to a celebration. We're counting backward. Through empires, reforms, religious resistance, political maneuvering. And decisions that were never meant to feel personal. Yet quietly shaped the rhythm of everyday life. Because January 1st isn't just a date. It's a surviving artifact. Of one of the longest-running political agreements in history. And once you see how it was chosen, you may never experience the new year in quite the same way again. Part 1, Time before January. Before calendars had names. Before months were numbered. Before years were boxed into grids. Time was not something you checked. It was something you noticed. The length of a shadow. The position of the sun at dawn. The way cold loosened its grip on the soil. The moment water returned to dry land. Early humans didn't ask what day it was. They asked whether it was safe to plant. Whether animals would migrate. Whether winter was loosening or tightening. Time was functional. It answered one question above all others. What happens next? Long before written history, people learned that the sky repeats itself. Not perfectly. Not mechanically. But predictably enough to trust. The sun returned to familiar positions. The moon completed its cycles. Stars shifted, slowly, but consistently. From this repetition came the first attempts to organize life. Not to dominate it. But to survive it. A year wasn't a number. It was a full loop of consequences. Plant too early, and crops failed. Plant too late, and they never matured. Celebrate too soon, and hunger followed. Celebrate too late, and the moment was already gone. So the beginning of the year mattered. But not in the way it does now. In many early civilizations, the year began when life visibly restarted. When rivers flooded and left fertile soil behind. When days grew longer instead of shorter. When survival tipped, slightly, back in humanity's favor. In the ancient world, spring was not symbolic. It was practical. Fields became workable. Armies could move. Trade routes reopened. Construction resumed. So the year often began there, not because it felt hopeful. But because it worked. Elsewhere, time followed water. Some cultures measured the year by floods. Events so reliable they reshaped entire civilizations. When the water came, the year turned. When it receded, life followed. Other societies followed the moon. Not because it was mystical. But because it was visible. You didn't need instruments. You didn't need literacy. You only needed to look up. The moon offered a natural count. A rhythm anyone could observe. But lunar cycles didn't align cleanly with seasons. They drifted. So these calendars required constant adjustment. Constant human judgment. And that judgment mattered. Because whoever decided when a cycle began also decided when debts were due. When rituals were held. When authority renewed itself. At first, those decisions were communal. Elders observed patterns. Priests watched the sky. Farmers compared results. Time belonged to the environment. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, time began to belong to institutions. As societies grew larger, coordination became more important than precision. It wasn't enough for one village to agree on the start of a year. Cities had to align. Regions had to synchronize. Armies had to move on schedule. And once coordination becomes essential, time stops being neutral. Because synchronization creates leverage. If everyone agrees the year begins at the same moment, then power can also reset at the same moment. Titles renew. Offices change hands. Obligations restart. This is where time begins to shift. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But directionally. From observation to organization. From nature to structure. Before January existed, the start of the year made sense in the body. You could feel it. Warmth returned. Light lingered longer. The world signaled continuation. Winter, by contrast, was an ending. Food stores ran low. Movement slowed. Survival narrowed. To declare the beginning of a year in winter would have felt counterintuitive. Even reckless. And yet, that is exactly where the modern year begins. Which raises a quiet but important question. If January doesn't come from the sky, and it doesn't come from agriculture, and it doesn't come from biology, then where does it come from? Because dates don't move themselves. Someone has to place them. And once dates are placed, everything else begins to arrange itself around them. Taxes. Contracts. Military terms. Political authority. This is the moment. Still early in the story. Where time stops being a reflection of the world. And starts becoming a tool used to manage it. And that transition doesn't begin in nature. It begins in a city. A city that would eventually decide that the year should start. Not when life returns, but when power does. Part 2, Rome, where politics entered time. The shift did not happen in the countryside. It did not happen among farmers watching the soil. It happened in a city. A city built on expansion. On administration. On the belief that order could be imposed. And maintained. Across vast distances. Rome did not merely conquer territory. It organized it. Roads were laid with precision. Laws were standardized. Citizenship was defined, revoked, extended. And eventually, time itself was brought under control. In early Rome, the calendar was simple. Almost crude. 10 months. A year that began in March. A rhythm aligned, loosely, with the return of warmth and activity. March mattered because movement mattered. Armies could march. Construction could resume. Politics could restart. Winter sat outside the system. Uncounted. Unmanaged. It was not time for action. It was time for waiting. So the Roman year opened where effort resumed. Not where hope sounded poetic. But where power could function. For a while, this worked. But Rome was not static. It grew. It absorbed peoples, customs, obligations. And growth demands coordination. As Rome expanded, the calendar began to strain. Festivals drifted. Months slipped away from seasons. Religious observances no longer aligned with the sky. To compensate, Roman officials inserted extra days when needed. Not astronomers. Not farmers. Officials. These adjustments were not always neutral. Extending a year could keep someone in office longer. Shortening it could rush an election. Time became elastic. And elasticity favors those who can stretch it. It was during this period that 2 months were added. Quietly. Deliberately. January. February. They were placed at the end of the year at first. A kind of administrative appendix. A holding space. January took its name from Janus. Janus was not a god of harvest or war. He did not rule the sky or the earth. He ruled transitions. Doorways. Thresholds. Beginnings and endings. He was depicted with 2 faces. One looking backward. The other forward. In Roman thought, this was not poetry. It was governance. Janus presided over moments when order reset. And Rome was becoming a society obsessed with resets. Over time, January moved. From the margins to the center. Not because the season demanded it. Because administration did. Roman leaders wanted consistency. They wanted tax collection to begin at the same time each year. They wanted officials to assume power predictably. They wanted military command structures aligned. March was inconvenient. It tied authority to agriculture. To weather. To uncertainty. January, by contrast, was clean. Cold. Inactive. Administrative. Nothing competed with it. No planting. No harvest. No natural distractions. Which made it ideal. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman consuls, the highest elected officials, began taking office on January 1st. This was not symbolic. It was strategic. If leadership began in January, then the year began in January. If the year began in January, then Rome began on Rome's terms. The calendar stopped following life. Life began following the calendar. This change did not arrive with fireworks. There was no public announcement. No philosophical debate. It arrived through practice. Through paperwork. Through precedent. Through repetition. And repetition is powerful. When people repeat something long enough, it stops feeling chosen. It starts feeling inevitable. By anchoring the year to January, Rome aligned time with authority. Military campaigns could be planned earlier. Taxes could be assessed sooner. Political transitions could occur without waiting for spring. Time became predictable. And predictability favors centralized power. This is the critical shift. The calendar was no longer a reflection of the natural world. It became a framework for managing people. Rome had discovered something subtle and enduring. You don't need to tell people what to do. If you tell them when things begin, the date itself does the work. And once January was positioned as the opening of the year, everything else rearranged around it. Rituals adapted. Legal terms aligned. Public memory adjusted. Even resistance, when it appeared, had to operate within the calendar it opposed. Because by this point, January was no longer just a month. It was an instrument. A quiet one. A reliable one. And Rome was very good at instruments that lasted. But Rome's solution was not perfect. The calendar it relied on still drifted. Still slipped against the sky. The very system designed to create order was accumulating error. Small at first. Barely noticeable. Minutes per year. Then hours. Then days. And over generations, that error would grow large enough to force a reckoning. A reckoning that would place time in the hands of a single individual. Not a senate. Not a council. One man. And when that moment arrives, time will stop being negotiated and start being enforced. Part 3, Julius Caesar changes everything. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's calendar was no longer just imperfect. It was unstable. Months drifted slowly away from the seasons they were meant to represent. Festivals arrived too early, or too late. Religious rites lost their alignment with the sky. Agricultural markers no longer matched the land. At first, the problem was subtle. Barely noticeable within a single lifetime. But time compounds its errors quietly. An extra minute here. A missed adjustment there. And because Rome relied on human intervention to correct the calendar, correction itself became political. Only certain officials had the authority to add days. Only certain people could decide when the year would be extended or shortened. That authority was often abused. A year could be stretched to keep allies in office longer. It could be compressed to rush enemies out of power. What began as a technical adjustment became a political instrument. By the time Rome entered its period of civil war, the calendar was no longer trusted. The year said one thing. The season said another. And for an empire that depended on coordination, military, legal, economic, that mismatch was dangerous. This is the environment into which Julius Caesar stepped. Caesar was not only a general. He was not only a politician. He was an administrator. He understood something that many of his rivals did not. Power doesn't only come from armies. It comes from systems. And systems require consistency. During his time in Egypt, Caesar encountered a different approach to time. One that relied less on human discretion and more on observation. Egyptian astronomers followed the sun, not the moon. Not priestly adjustments. The solar year. Longer, more stable, less negotiable. Caesar paid attention. When he returned to Rome, he did not simply want to fix the calendar. He wanted to end the argument around it. The result was reform on a scale Rome had never seen. The old system was swept aside. Extra months were inserted to realign the year with the seasons. That transition year became known, quietly, as the Year of Confusion. It lasted 445 days. Long enough to reset everything. Then came the new structure. A solar calendar. 12 months. A fixed year length. Predictable leap adjustments. For the first time, the Roman year was anchored to the sun. Not to political convenience. And crucially, January was placed at the front. Not symbolically. Functionally. January 1st was confirmed as the official beginning of the year. This was not debated publicly. It was declared. Time, from that point forward, would be standardized. Across Rome. Across its territories. Across its administration. For an empire, this was revolutionary. Military terms could be synchronized. Tax years standardized. Political offices aligned across vast distances. The calendar became infrastructure. Invisible. Foundational. Assumed. And like most infrastructure, its power lay in how rarely it was questioned. But this reform came with a trade-off. By placing the authority to define time in the hands of a single ruler, Rome achieved order. At the cost of neutrality. The calendar no longer drifted randomly. But it was no longer organic either. It followed a decree. A rule written into time itself. January 1st now marked more than a date. It marked a reset of power. Consuls assumed office. Legal terms began. Military commands renewed. The year did not open when the land was ready. It opened when the state was ready. And that distinction mattered. Because once time is standardized, it becomes enforceable. Miss a deadline, and consequences follow. Ignore a term, and authority responds. The calendar was no longer a guide. It was a framework. And frameworks endure. Caesar's reform was so effective that it outlived him. It survived assassinations, civil wars, the collapse of the Republic. Even as emperors replaced senators, the calendar remained. Ticking forward. Reliable. Predictable. But not perfect. Because even a solar calendar, carefully designed, carries a flaw. A flaw so small it would take centuries to notice. But so persistent it would eventually force the world to confront time once again. And when that moment arrives, the authority to decide when the year begins will shift from emperors to the Church. Part 4, The Church versus January 1st. When Rome adopted January 1st as the opening of the year, it solved an administrative problem. But it created another. Because Rome's calendar did not disappear when Rome's gods did. As Christianity spread through the empire, it inherited something unexpected. A timeline designed by pagans. Not just dates. Not just month names. A rhythm of life already synchronized to imperial authority. For the early church, this posed a dilemma. On one hand, the calendar was practical. It unified cities. It organized obligations. It kept society moving in step. On the other hand, January 1st carried meanings the church did not control. It was tied to Roman civic power. To imperial transitions. To older rituals of renewal that had nothing to do with Christian theology. And so, quietly, resistance began. Not as rebellion. But as redefinition. Rather than declare January 1st sacred, the church shifted attention elsewhere. In many regions, the year began in March. A moment closer to spring. Closer to rebirth. Elsewhere, it began with Easter. A movable feast anchored not to a fixed date, but to a religious narrative. In some places, the year turned at Christmas. The birth of Christ, not the authority of the state, became the symbolic reset. This fragmentation was not accidental. By refusing to unify around January 1st, the church weakened the calendar's political grip. Time, once again, became plural. Different cities. Different regions. Different beginnings. The same date could mean different things depending on where you stood. From the church's perspective, this was a feature, not a flaw. Because a single calendar implies a single authority. And the church was not interested in reinforcing Roman civic power. January 1st, in particular, was uncomfortable. It carried echoes of earlier rituals. Of doorways and transitions. Of old gods and civic oaths. It marked the moment when Roman officials assumed office. When political authority renewed itself. To Christian leaders, this was not spiritually neutral. It was pagan residue. So instead of abolishing January 1st outright, which would have been impractical, the church surrounded it. Christian feasts were layered over Roman dates. Meanings were reassigned. Attention was redirected. The calendar became a palimpsest. Old ink faintly visible beneath new writing. For centuries, Europe lived with multiple new years. Merchants counted differently than monks. Kings dated documents differently than priests. Cities followed customs their neighbors ignored. This was inconvenient. But it served a purpose. When time is fragmented, no single institution fully owns it. Yet fragmentation also has a cost. Trade suffers. Records conflict. Legal systems strain. As kingdoms grew stronger, they demanded consistency. And consistency inevitably raises the question. Who decides? By the late medieval period, Europe faced a paradox. The Roman calendar, refined under imperial rule, was still the most functional system available. But its authority was contested. The church had resisted January 1st for theological reasons. States increasingly favored it for administrative ones. Time became a negotiation. Between heaven and earth. Between ritual and regulation. Between meaning and management. This tension simmered for generations. Until a different problem forced a decision. Because beneath the religious disagreements, beneath the political maneuvering, the calendar itself was drifting, again. Not by days at first. Not even by hours. By minutes. Small discrepancies accumulating quietly. Year after year. Until sacred dates no longer aligned with the events they commemorated. Until Easter crept further from spring. Until theology and astronomy disagreed. At that point, the question was no longer whether to change the calendar, but who had the authority to do it. And that question would place time into the hands of the most centralized institution left standing in Europe. Part 5, The Gregorian Power Move. By the 16th century, the problem could no longer be ignored. The calendar Rome had inherited from Caesar, the one refined, defended, and resisted for over 1,000 years, was no longer aligned with the sky it claimed to represent. The discrepancy was small. Almost invisible on a human scale. But time does not forget small errors. It accumulates them. The Julian calendar assumed the year was slightly longer than it truly was. By just under 11 minutes. A difference too small to matter in a single year. Too small to matter in a decade. But over centuries, those minutes became hours. Those hours became days. By the 1500s, the calendar had slipped by nearly 10 days. Spring was arriving earlier than the calendar said it should. Religious festivals tied to seasons were drifting. Sacred observances no longer matched the natural events they symbolized. For the Church, this was not an academic concern. Christian theology depended on time being right. Easter, in particular, was defined in relation to the spring equinox. When the equinox moved on the calendar, the meaning of the celebration moved with it. The calendar was undermining doctrine. And doctrine, in turn, demanded correction. But correcting time was not a neutral act. To change the calendar was to declare authority over every clock. Every document. Every contract. Every life structured around dates. It required legitimacy strong enough to survive resistance. That legitimacy, in the 16th century, belonged to one institution. The papacy. Under Pope Gregory XIII, the Church acted. Not impulsively. Not quietly. Deliberately. Astronomers were consulted. Calculations were reviewed. A solution was designed not just to fix the past error, but to prevent its return. The adjustment was precise. Leap years would be refined. Century years would be handled differently. The calendar would follow the sun more accurately than it ever had before. But accuracy alone was not enough. The accumulated error still had to be removed. And removing it meant one thing. Time would have to jump. In October of 1582, the decision was enacted. The calendar advanced forward. Not by hours. Not by a day. But by 10 full days. October 4th was followed immediately by October 15th. No gradual transition. No easing. 10 days disappeared. Not symbolically. Literally. People went to sleep on one date. And woke up nearly 2 weeks later. For those who lived through it, time had been altered by decree. This was unprecedented. Never before had an institution simply erased days from the calendar. And expected society to comply. And compliance was far from guaranteed. In regions loyal to the papacy, the change was enforced quickly. In others, it was rejected outright. Some saw it as a correction. Others saw it as theft. Workers believed their lives had been shortened. 10 days of wages gone. 10 days of aging imposed without consent. Protests followed. Riots erupted in some cities. Not because people misunderstood astronomy, but because they understood power. If time itself could be rewritten, what couldn't be? The deeper issue was trust. The Church had solved a technical problem, but it had exposed a political reality. Time was no longer something that happened. It was something decided. And not everyone accepted who was doing the deciding. Countries fractured along familiar lines. Catholic regions adopted the new calendar quickly. Protestant and Orthodox regions resisted. Not because the math was wrong, but because authority was contested. Accepting the Gregorian calendar meant acknowledging papal influence. Rejecting it became an act of political and religious independence. As a result, Europe entered a strange period. The same day could exist twice. Or not at all. Depending on where you stood. A merchant crossing borders might gain days or lose them. Diplomatic correspondence became confused. Historical records conflicted. Time itself was no longer universal. But over decades, practicality began to outweigh resistance. Trade required coordination. Navigation required consistency. Administration demanded uniformity. One by one, regions adopted the Gregorian system. Sometimes reluctantly. Sometimes generations later. The calendar, once again, proved its quiet strength. It did not need persuasion. It only needed usage. Once adopted, it became invisible. Once invisible, it became unquestioned. January 1st survived the reform. Not because it was ancient. Not because it was natural. But because it was already embedded. The Gregorian reform corrected the sky, but preserved the structure of power that came with it. Time was now more accurate than ever. And more centralized than ever. The year still began where Rome had placed it. Where Caesar had confirmed it. Where administration found it useful. The church had reshaped time. But it had not moved its starting line. And in doing so, it ensured that January 1st would outlive empires, reformations, and even belief systems. Because by this point, January 1st was no longer Roman. It was institutional. And institutions have long memories. Part 6, Global Adoption, when empires standardized time. By the time the Gregorian calendar had proven its accuracy, its authority was still uneven. Time, once again, depended on where you lived. In some regions, days had been removed. In others, they remained. Letters crossed borders carrying dates that didn't agree. Contracts referenced days that didn't exist everywhere. For local life, this confusion could be tolerated. For empires, it could not. Empires depend on synchronization. Troops must move on schedule. Taxes must be collected on time. Ships must arrive when ports are open. Records must align across thousands of miles. And no empire could function with multiple versions of the same year. This is where January 1st stops being a European preference and starts becoming a global standard. One of the last major holdouts was Britain. Not because British astronomers rejected the math. They didn't. But because adopting the Gregorian calendar meant accepting a reform introduced by Rome. And Britain's political identity was defined, in part, by rejecting papal authority. So Britain waited. For decades, it continued using the older Julian system. Its calendar drifted further from continental Europe. By the 18th century, Britain was 11 days behind. That gap was no longer abstract. Trade suffered. Navigation complicated. International agreements became messy. Eventually, resistance became impractical. In 1752, Britain acted. The reform was swift, decisive, and deeply unsettling. 11 days were removed. September 2nd was followed by September 14th. No gradual adjustment. No soft transition. Time moved forward because the state said it must. Public reaction was immediate. Some accepted the change quietly. Others did not. Protests erupted in several cities. Not because people misunderstood the reform, but because they understood its implications. They felt time had been taken from them. Days of life. Days of labor. Days of rent and wages. The phrase, "Give us our 11 days," echoed in the streets. Whether entirely accurate or not, the sentiment mattered. People were responding not to astronomy, but to authority. And authority had spoken clearly. From that moment on, January 1st was no longer just Rome's beginning of the year. It was Britain's. And Britain did not keep time to itself. As the British Empire expanded, so did its calendar. Administrative systems were exported alongside railways, laws, and language. Colonial governments required standardized records. Courts required fixed dates. Schools, ports, and tax offices followed suit. January 1st arrived not with celebration, but with paperwork. In Africa, local calendars had long followed seasons, rains, and harvests. In parts of Asia, lunar and lunisolar systems governed festivals and agriculture. In the Americas, indigenous timekeeping systems still shaped daily life. But imperial administration required uniformity. Colonial rule did not replace local calendars overnight. It simply overlaid them. Official business followed January 1st. Budgets reset then. Legal years began then. Education cycles aligned to it. Over time, what was official became habitual. And what was habitual became normal. This is how time spreads. Not through persuasion, but through necessity. If you wanted to trade, you adapted. If you wanted to work within the system, you aligned. If you wanted recognition, you adopted the calendar that power recognized. January 1st did not ask for belief. It demanded compliance. And compliance, repeated over generations, became tradition. By the 20th century, the calendar had become global. Not because the world debated it and agreed, but because the systems that governed the world required it. Rail timetables, shipping schedules, international treaties, financial markets, all synchronized to the same starting point. Time zones standardized the hours. The Gregorian calendar standardized the year. January 1st became the shared reset. Even societies that maintained traditional calendars now lived alongside the global one. Festivals followed ancient rhythms. Governments followed January. Daily life became bilingual in time. And once that happens, the dominant system rarely retreats. By the time fireworks replaced proclamations, the decision had already been made centuries earlier. January 1st no longer belonged to emperors or popes. It belonged to infrastructure. To systems so deeply embedded that imagining alternatives felt impractical. The calendar had completed its transformation. From observation, to administration, to empire, and now, to inevitability. But inevitability has consequences. Because when a date becomes universal, it begins to shape how people think, how they plan, how they hope, how they measure progress. Which brings us to the present. To a world that treats January 1st not just as a date, but as a psychological boundary. A moment charged with expectation. And that effect was never accidental. Part 7, Why This Still Matters Today. By the time January 1st became universal, its origins no longer mattered. What mattered was function. A shared starting line allows millions of unrelated decisions to move in the same direction. That alignment has power. Modern societies are built on cycles. Financial, educational, political. And nearly all of them hinge on the same moment. Budgets reset. Targets are recalculated. Performance is measured again from zero. Not because nature requires it, but because systems do. The calendar doesn't just mark time. It shapes behavior. A deadline feels real because the calendar says it is. A goal feels urgent because a date approaches. A failure feels final because a year has ended. January 1st creates a psychological boundary. It divides effort into before and after, past and future. What was attempted, and what will be attempted again. This boundary is subtle, but it is deeply effective. People delay change until a symbolic reset arrives. Organizations postpone decisions until a new cycle begins. Governments roll obligations forward or close them out based on a year's edge. The calendar turns intention into structure, and structure influences choice. This is why resolutions cluster, why fiscal years matter, why elections follow cycles. When everyone shares the same clock, behavior synchronizes, even unintentionally. The beginning of the year becomes a moment of permission. Permission to start. Permission to stop. Permission to redefine direction. That permission doesn't come from the sky. It comes from agreement. An agreement inherited, rarely examined, and almost never renegotiated. The result is a world that moves in rhythm, with a decision made long before anyone alive today had a say. This doesn't mean January 1st is harmful. It means it is influential. And influence, when invisible, is at its strongest. Understanding that influence changes how the date feels. It turns celebration into context. Fireworks into markers, not causes. The year doesn't truly begin because the clock reaches midnight. It begins because societies decide to treat that moment as meaningful. And that decision, repeated across centuries, has outlived empires. It survived Rome's fall. It adapted through religious conflict. It spread through colonial administration. It embedded itself in global systems. January 1st did not win because it was inevitable. It won because it was useful. Now, the lasting decision. When the world celebrates the new year, it isn't honoring a natural cycle. It's honoring continuity. A chain of decisions. Political, administrative, institutional. That proved durable enough to shape everyday life. January 1st isn't ancient wisdom. It isn't cosmic alignment. It's a surviving framework. One that quietly organizes how time is counted, how progress is measured, and how beginnings are imagined. The date feels personal because it has been shared for so long. But its endurance tells a different story. This is not a tradition that emerged from the ground. It is one that was installed, maintained, and normalized. Which means the next time the year turns, nothing mystical is happening. What's happening is participation. Participation in one of the longest-lasting political agreements in human history. And once you recognize that, January 1st stops being a moment that controls you and becomes one you can choose how to use.